Hi guys, so part two, chapter two. You can see what was covered in the previous sessions. Now on to cattle ranching, how America gets rich. Okay, so the growth. Really, again, that Civil War comes back into it. Remember how important the Civil War is. During the Civil War, the long haul cattle had increased dramatically, and there was 5 million in Texas. Now, after the Civil War's done, beef was in demand in the big industrial cities in the north, and in Chicago, a cow was worth up to $40. So Chicago in the north, but because the southern economy had been so badly damaged, a cow was only worth $5 in the south. So simple economics, you want to make the money, you need to get them to the north. So the Texans want to cash in on this, and they start driving them to the north. They were prevented in Kansas because the farmers there were worried that these cattle, Texan cattle, were going to bring this fever that they could, or disease that they could pass on to their cows. So there was a little bit of a quarantine at the start. There's a good graphic of all the trails. I'm not going to go through them, but make sure you read them. The key ones there are Chisholm Trail, Goodnight and Loving. All right, they're the two main ones, but have a look at all of them. Right, so this will be a shorter one because we're mainly going to be focusing on the key players in the cattle industry. First one is Joseph McCoy in Abilene. Okay, now, Joseph McCoy, he realized Abilene, Kansas would make a great Abilene's in Kansas would make a great transit point for the cattle drives for three reasons. Transit point meaning good place to get his cattle to and put them on trains. The quarantine laws have been relaxed that we looked at just before, so cattle can now be driven through Kansas to the cow town. A trading route called the Chisholm Trail with plenty of grass could be used to bring the cattle north, so there's a direct route there. The cattle could then be could be placed onto not onto the railroad. They're not going to, have these cattle be massacred. They're going to put them onto the rail carts on the railroad at Abilene and then taken to Chicago. So it's a great way to use the railroad to access these big industrial cities. McCoy, he bought land, built stockyards to keep his cattle there, arranged a depot to be built on the side of the track of the Kansas Pacific Railroad. He arranged for the Chisholm Trail to be marked out through Indian Territory all the way up to Abilene. So again, he's really doing his work here. He's plotting it out. He's arranging things so it all works for him. And he spends $5,000 on marketing for this new venture in Texas, and it promising a safe trail and great profit at the end of it. 35,000 cattle were then driven to Abilene by 1867, 3 million by 72. Those are great statistics to show how important Joseph McCoy is. And he becomes incredibly rich. You should know Joseph McCoy inside out, guys, and you should at least be connecting him to Abilene and the Chisholm Trail, right? That's what I'd be expecting to see when I'm marking these. Okay, Goodnight and Loving. So you can see these veer off to the left a little bit. So it was established in 1866 by Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, who drove a herd of 2,000 cattle to Fort Sumner in New Mexico, where the cattle were used to feed the army in the forts and Indians on reservations. So Goodnight and Loving, they're after the reservations and the army, all right? Then they were paid $12,000 for 800 cattle, 4 times their worth in Texas. And when they returned to Texas for another herd, they moved the remaining 1,200 cattle north, sold them to John Iliff, who'd started building up his ranch. So they make a real bit of money from from creating this trail to allow them to get to certain places. They continue then to go to the mining towns. So when you're thinking Goodnight and Loving, think get it to John Iliff, get it to the army, get it to the Indians on the reservations, get it to the mining towns. All right, they're the 4 keys. Okay. And by 1876, he was so successful his ranch had expanded to 1 million acres. Right, John Iliff. So his ranching on the plains, you should be aware of him. So he bought a herd of cattle for $500, a cheap price, as the cattle were kind of exhausted from the long drive from Texas. They were too thin to sell for beef. And in the same year, gold had been found in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, which meant that there was a great demand for meat, but it was difficult to transport supplies there as there was no railroad to connect them. Eilif decided if he could fatten up his new herd on the plains grass, he would be able to sell the beef at a good price to the mining town. So he thought, let's cut out this whole long drive thing that's weakening my cattle. I'll just raise them on this open land. So he bought land for this open range near Denver, and he had a herd of 26,000 cattle covering 16,000 acres, and he became the first Denver millionaire, selling beef to mining towns, teams building the Pacific Railroad, and the government and Indian reservations. He was important as he raised cattle on the plains rather than driving up Texas. So he's so important to this open range, right? One of the first to do it. And the fact that he becomes the first Denver millionaire highlights how important he was and how much of an impact he has. You get the rise of the cattle barons. So people kind of clock on to think, right, beef's the way forward. Everyone wants some beef. So in the 1870s, there was a beef bonanza, right, in the West. And although the long drives, they continue from Texas to Kansas, the big growth was in ranching on the plains. The cattle industry was seen as an easy way to make kind of money. It was low cost, fed grass, you got free land until we get the homesteaders start taking up parts of the land, which leads to the cattle ranchers versus the homesteaders, which we'll get to. Profits were very high, and so a lot of people wanted to get involved. The fact that people could get so rich meant people were willing to invest in these businesses. It was a huge boom, and these guys dominated. The best way to make money was have these huge ranches, and that meant only a few big cattle barons just dominated the industry. They had wealth and influence. They controlled the law courts as well. They were so important to this period, and they defended their interests fiercely. They were dangerous men. People caught cattle rustling. The ranchers would go after them. They wouldn't go to the police. They'd hire a posse and go out and get them. And we see that in the Johnson County War when they hire the Texan gunslingers. Right. We'll finish this one by looking just a little bit at life on the long drive. So driving a herd of cattle took 2 to 3 months on the Tristram Trail, but 6 months on the Goodnight Loving, so it was a long trail. The cowboys, they slept in the open, they took it in turns. The cattle would graze when they woke, and they organized into a long line. They would travel around 15, 20 miles a day. This was hard work, guys. Problems was challenging. Half the longhorns, they got spooked easily. These were a lot of cattle, and then they'd just run off. So it's a lot for the cowboy to try and round them up. Stampeding cattle could get lost, injured, or killed, and running long distances meant they lost weight and became even less valuable. There were also challenges for crossing rivers, dealing with snakes and wild animals, getting permission to cross Indian territory, protecting cattle from rustlers. Then, at the end of the long drive, when the cowboys reached places like Abilene, the cattle would be herded into stockyards, inspected and bought. They would be herded on railroad boxcars, and the cowboys would be paid. Once the cowboys would be paid, they'd get cleaned up, buy new clothes, get drunk, dance with townswomen, gamble and fight. This was ruthless and brutal, right? This led to the lawlessness in the cow towns. Well, the ranchers changed things a little bit. So cattle raised in the ranch to be over huge areas, and they were really difficult to deal with in the winter because the cattle roam freely, and there's not a lot of work for the cowboys during winter. Now, in the spring, you have the roundup. Now, cowboys would fan out from a central location, driving the cattle to a central point. And when they were rounded up, they then had to be branded to show which ranch they belonged to. Because in the open range, you've got all the cows kind of mingling. But the ranchers have branded their own cows. So when they bring them together, they kind of select, right, which one's our cattle, which one's yours. So in the spring, new calves would have to be branded with the same mark as their mother. So, to guess which one is, if the calf following around your cow, that's probably going to be that cow's calf. Life on the ranch was hard work. Most cowboys are in their early 20s. Cowboys lived in the bunkhouse, which was more comfortable than living outdoors. There wasn't a lot of entertainment. Goodnight even banned gambling. Ranches on the plains were open. They carried roundups in the same way as the Texans. Its biggest problem was in the winter. Heavy snow was an issue because cattle couldn't access water. They struggled to access the grass because of the snow. So the cowboys had to look after them. They had to ride out in the blizzards to kind of like make sure they could get to water, they could get to grass, they could bring them to shelter. So it was a tough job. And that's important because when we get to the Great Die-Up, you see how that fails and leads to the end of the open ranch. Right, okay, that was under 10 minutes. That was a quick run through the ranching.